number of people here who actually were here at the beginning. As many of you probably have heard, Charlie Kirk was one of those people, and very influential and involved in the starting of the church. He attended St. Timothy's and came over here to start this church. And I had gotten Charlie all excited. Charlie was really excited to come down. We talked on Sunday 2 weeks ago, and he said, I have a lot of meds. I invited him to stay at my house overnight, so he'd be right here. And he said, I got too many meds. I'm on oxygen, but I've got my son-in-law and my daughter bringing me down, and we'll be there in time for it. We might be a few minutes late. And he said, I'll share lots of stories about the beginning of the church. And 4 days later, he passed away. So, and his funeral, as you may, if you weren't at the first service, you'll hear at the second service, his funeral will be here this Friday at 10:30. So I actually tried to get 4 people who are current members of this church to be here this morning. 2 of them are in rehearsing with the bell choir, so they won't be here. And a couple others conveniently went out of town. And then I tried to get 4 more people that I knew, mostly who attend Christ Church in Denver. And at the last minute, they all said, I don't know if I want to do that. And 2 of them said, oh, by the way, we got to go out of town. So show of hands. And I just want to go 1 through 5 real quickly. And I'm just curious, and then we'll come back at the end and talk more about this. How many of you know who Jim Greathead is? Okay. Except for Mark and Sandra, they're the only ones that know why I have his name up there, because they shared that at coffee hour. We originally bought 2.2 acres. Why do we only own 2.069 acres today?
Should we raise our hands if we know the answer?
Yeah, you know the answer. 1, 2, well, 4. I didn't think you knew that one.
Well, he knows now.
Why did the diocese pay to Good Shepherd $20,000 to Good Shepherd in 1977 to 79 and $50,000 in 1994? How many of you know the answer to that?
Are they asking for it back?
Yeah. Number 4, how do I know who is the senior warden in every year? How many of you know where you can go find that? Most of you should know that. Yeah. And the last one is, when did Hungry Flock, the dinner club, start? How many of you know that? That'll surprise you. Okay, we'll come back to those at the very end. And maybe, I don't know all these stories about the first 7 or 8 years, but what most of you don't realize that in 1970, Bev and I moved to Columbine Hills, and we lived over in Jefferson County. And the only Episcopal church at that time was St. Timothy's in downtown Littleton. If you ever go down Littleton Boulevard, there's a drink wine mortuary, and there was a Wedgwood, I think it was Wedgwood restaurant there, where a lot of us gathered after the service. And St. Timothy's was tucked in right behind those 2. And Cherry Creek, the Cricket. The Cricket is about to take over that restaurant and open a restaurant in downtown Littleton. And so that's interesting. But Bev and I attended St. Timothy's, and we wanted to form a church over in southern Jefferson County. And so Bev and I became part of the group that decided to form St. Gregory's. And we did it by helping the curate at St. Timothy's to purchase a home over there. And we met in that person's basement for a couple of years. And then we bought some property, and then we built St. Gregory's. I tell you that story because that is the model that St. Timothy knew for forming a new church, reaching out and forming a new church. And so that becomes much in play when we begin to talk about the start of Good Shepherd. In the beginning, all the people that started this church or started Good Shepherd, most of them were at St. Timothy's. And they met, and I'm going to, at the end of this, sitting back on the back table, are copies of the history that we did like 6 years ago about Good Shepherd. And fortunately, it's broken into exactly the same frames that we're going to do this series in. So even though Trish Hartman is practicing bells in there, she wrote the first part about the history while Father Art was here. And so you're going to have her thoughts when you pick up a copy of that on your way out today. But Charlie and Trish were two of the key people. They actually met over at St. Thomas More with a person representing from the diocese, and talked about forming a church out here. And you got to remember that church, at that time, this area was just starting to be built up. So it was a perfect place for a church to be because you had a lot of new people moving into the area. And consequently, they were asked to go out and survey the houses that were occupied and see if there was enough interest for a new church. And they did that. And all these people that did that, I think there was 3 or 4 of them, all remember that very vividly because virtually none of them wanted to go do it. And so they did that. And the next thing that came up was the process of picking an initial rector for Good Shepherd. There was a priest in Colorado Springs who was a Catholic priest at one time. And he had decided he had fallen in love with a nun. So you had a Catholic priest and a nun, and they both decided they were in love with each other. Consequently, they wanted to have a family, and they both decided to leave the Catholic Church. And it wasn't long after that Father Art Leclare actually moved up here. And if you want to go see where the original church for Good Shepherd was, it's at 8221 East Fremont Circle. So it's not far away, and you can go by the house. We ought to all go by at the same time. And they'll just love that. And you can see, but the decision was made. Bishop Fry at that time asked Father Art if he would consider being the initial rector for Good Shepherd. Of course, at that time, it was going to be a mission because they were just starting the church. And so in March of 1976, they had their first meeting in the basement of his home. You'll read the story back there. I always thought it was interesting. They parked their son out on the steps. And as people came up to the house, he told everybody, you go through the garage and down to the basement, because Joanne, his wife, didn't want people tromping through her house. And so David, one of their sons, that was his role. And so he played that role for quite a while. And it slowly began to grow. And they actually spent 2 years in the basement at his home. And then the church moved to Dry Creek Elementary, which is the elementary school that's down the street from here. And they moved there for 2 years. And it was in that period of time, as the church was beginning to grow, they began to look around for possible sites for a church. And the first site they really picked was on the corner of Yosemite and Dry Creek. And it was on the southwest corner. And there was going to be they need to do a lot of fill there, and that discouraged them a little bit. So they eventually in 1979 paid $37,000 to buy this 2.2 acres here. And people have asked me over the years, why didn't they buy more so we had a bigger parking lot and so forth? What you need to understand, at the time that they bought this property, the land was plotted out, and where these apartments are now was going to be a shopping center. And because a shopping center was going to go in there, the thought was, hey, Sunday mornings, we'll have all this parking to use. So we'll have lots of parking beyond the parking we have here. So it made a lot of sense that they only bought the 2.2 acres. And I think that was probably, I think part of that, if you knew the history of St. Gregory's, the diocese actually gave us $19,000 to buy property adjacent to a Catholic church. Well, in 77 to 79, the church, the diocese actually gave this church $20,000 to help pay for Father Art's salary, but also to give him that seed money to be able to buy this property. And so that was the initial reason. The one thing that will really surprise you in there, in July of 1976, so what? You have March, April, May, June, July, 4 months after the church started, the people got together and said, well, how can we get together and build relationships? And they started Hungry Flock. So Hungry Flock started 4 months after the initial first meeting of this church. And if you hear about Hungry Flock today, I mean, that means it's been going 45 years. And it's, just a way for people to get together, socialize, and get to know each other better. So obviously, the church was a diocesan mission because it was small. I told you exactly where Father Art's home is. I hope you'll all go visit the historical. We ought to get, we could put a historical marker in the front yard. Yeah, right. That'd go over well. He still lives there. We had a funeral, Reba Greathead here earlier this year, and Father Art came back for that. He walks with a walker. I think Father Art's probably early 90s, 90, 91, 92. I'm not sure exactly. I can guess that because of some of the things I'm going to say in a little while. But and I walked up to him and he still remembered my name and so forth. I think he has some dementia, and that was one of the reasons we didn't invite him back, because I think he probably didn't want to come back either. As you'll hear some of the stories I'm going to share here in a little bit. We became a parish in 1985. The groundbreaking for the building here was April the 13th of 1980. And the first service was held here on December 21st of 1970. In other words, getting in just in time for Christmas that year. And initially what was...
Must be 80.
Yeah, and I'm trying to remember what initially was just, they didn't have a lot of money, so they didn't put basement underneath the initial area. So that's why where the parish hall is, there's no basement under that. The bathrooms and the kitchen were all where the offices are now. And so it was a lot smaller at that time, but it was kind of neat. None of this was here, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. Bev and I finally came to the church in early 1985. We came back and we were sitting there, and we were equally distanced from 3 churches: St. Gregory's, where we had started the church, St. Timothy's, which we had gone to, and Good Shepherd. And I don't know whether this is right or wrong, but I told Bev, it's real hard to go back to a place that you started because you got in your mind how it's supposed to be, and it doesn't look like that at all. And St. Gregory's primarily services southern Jefferson County. And downtown Littleton was a little bit farther away, so we made a decision to come here. Now I can tell the next story because Bev's not here. Bev's my wife, for any of you who don't know.
This is being recorded.
Yeah. But we came the first Sunday here, and of course the service was all over in the parish hall. And we were going through the service, and it came time to pass the peace. And we all stood up, and I turned around, and I don't know how many of you know her, but Nancy Johnson was standing right behind me. And I thought, I've just fallen in love again. But Nancy is a beautiful young lady, and I'm going, oh, peace be with you. And I thought I ought to give her a hug. But Nancy was a really neat person, and they've been very much involved in the overall development of Good Shepherd. They eventually moved on, but that was an interesting time for me personally. I'm sorry, Bev.
When we met in the parish hall, there were the plastic folding chairs.
Oh, yeah.
And that, by the way, was the original altar.
Yeah.
And so when we met in the parish hall, particularly in the winter, and everybody stood up, all you could hear is the chairs.
If you've ever come to a church picnic, are those the white chairs? Yeah, the white chairs. Believe it or not, they were very uncomfortable. And there were about 5 or 10 years ago, we gave them away to a church. And we just said, they're yours, and about 2 weeks later, they're back. So you can imagine how uncomfortable they were. And we still have them. When you come to a church picnic, you'll be sitting on the original white chairs. We used them at the last picnic. Yeah.
Was the white heat still there? It seemed like it's not conducive to.
The white partition that's above.
Yeah, the huge one that comes down from the ceiling and it kind of
that
divides the
column
room.
that's in the middle there now.
Yeah, right. That's what he's talking about.
It's not
Yeah, yeah.
there. And
I think that was put in with the expansion.
it was kind of neat because there were windows on the back side of there. You actually looked out west. So it was kind of neat.
Yeah. Well, there's a story there. I mean, the men's group started then, and we had these red sofas that were in that room. Whitney will remember them well. And we used to sit in those red sofas. And once you were down, you could not get up without somebody's help. Yeah. And we gave those away eventually.
And they stayed away, huh?
And they stayed away.
One more thing about the white chairs, those were the choir chairs. I think they even held on to some when we gave all the rest away for the choir until we finally got the upholstered
Yeah.
chairs for the choir.
Those were the good old days. I'm going to actually skip a little bit up until in about 89. And let me say, up until that time, Father Art had been a wonderful servant of the Lord in terms of developing the church and inviting people in. He was known as a very spiritual person, and we were growing. Now, I do have to say, with his Catholic background, if you think of Catholic priest, I guess that's the right word. Yeah. They're used to being in control. It's
Father knows best.
Father knows best, yes. And so consequently, I don't think that was negative, because you needed that kind of a background to start a church, because you had to do a lot of things every Sunday. And so the church continued to grow. And by the middle 80s, he started about 76. He'd been here 12 years. And I do know people told me that at between 10 and 12 years, he got a call to another church and he chose not to accept it. And he stayed with us. In about 89 is the first time I came on the vestry. And you got to understand, by that time, I had been a junior warden, a clerk, a treasurer. I had served on 7 vestries in 7 states. And so I came with a little bit of experience. And I was trying to remember who the senior warden, I'd have to go look. But the senior warden at that time was pretty strong personality, and everything seemed to be going pretty well. I had a 3-year term. On my 2nd year, we had a person who became the senior warden. And it was pretty obvious in a short period of time, he was probably in over his head. And at that time, we began to lose some people. And I lost some of my best friends. I like to say we sent missionaries to Christ Church in Denver, and we sent some really good missionaries to Christ Church in Denver. They came to me, a number of them came to me before they left. And one of the struggles they had gone to talk to the priest, Father Art. And basically they walked away with the feeling that it's my way or the highway. I always remember that. And you know, I think Father Art didn't believe a lot of people would take the highway, but a lot of people did. And in 1990, we were beginning to struggle a little bit, and we had lost some people. So believe it or not, and I'm not trying to pat myself on the back, we were struggling as a church. And I told Bev, look, the only thing I can think to do at this point is I'm going to offer myself up as a senior warden for Father Art. I had 5 meetings with him before he would agree to allow me to be the senior warden. He absolutely demanded that I do what he said. And he wanted to make sure that I didn't have an alternative motive for being the senior warden. And so it was interesting. 5 different times he called me in and we talked about it. And finally, he agreed to allow me to be the senior warden. I spent almost 2 years. Father Art and I would meet at the Harvest Restaurant, which is over in the Tech Center. We met once a month, a week before the vestry meeting, and we talk about what was on the vestry schedule. In those meetings, I was trying to convince Father Art that he had been here probably at that time about 17 years. And I said, you know, Father Art, there is a time when it's okay to retire. And I don't think he liked that, but he heard it for 2 years. And I figured, okay, I had given my 2 years trying to hold the church together and keep going. In the same time, we were a parish. And if you know the rules in the state of Colorado, a bishop cannot step in to do anything unless the vestry votes to ask the bishop to step in. So at that time, the bishop was Bishop Winterroot. His canon to the ordinary, who several of you are going to know pretty well, was Bert Womack. And Bert Womack and I had lunch together every 2 to 3 months. And so the bishop knew exactly what was going on at Good Shepherd. And he was very much aware of the situation. My last day of being the senior warden was at our annual meeting in January of '94. And I gave a presentation on where we were, and then Father Art got up to give a presentation, and he announced he was going to retire. And he never told me anything about that. You know, it was like, and I don't know if it was partially because of what I was saying or it was partially because of our meetings, but he announced he was going to retire. Now, however, yeah, if you know much about the church, and you may not realize this, we contribute to the pension fund. So 18% of what we're paying our rector goes into the pension fund. And at 25 years, they're able to get 100% of what they're entitled through to the pension fund. But if it's less than 25 years, it's a partial. And so Father Art had been a Catholic priest most of his career, and he had only had a service in the Episcopal Church with Good Shepherd. So at that time, he had about 17 years. And so this is one of the reasons I wish Charlie was here, because I handed over the senior warden responsibility to Charlie. And Charlie had met several times with Father Art. And at that particular point, Father Art informed Charlie that, look, I want you to conduct all the vestry meetings, but I'm not coming to any of the vestry meetings. And I think that'll go back a little bit, and Whitney knows this story. My last 6 months as a senior warden, I had 9 people on the vestry. At that point, I had 3 people that wanted Father Art to leave tomorrow. I had 3 people that wanted Father Art to retire on his schedule. And I had 3 people that really didn't care either way. That made for some very interesting vestry meetings. And we went through that, and I handed that over to Charlie. And Charlie, poor Charlie, didn't know exactly what he was going to do. But I don't remember, Whitney, how many meetings was it, 2 or 3? Before the vote was taken? Yeah, I think it was the second or third meeting. The vestry said, if the rector's not going to be here, we need to take a vote to decide to get whether or not we want to get the bishop involved. The vote was taken, and it was a close vote, but the decision was made to get the bishop involved. And so the bishop got involved. And the bishop, the first thing he did, he called a meeting. He wanted the parish to come together and have a meeting and talk about this, and he would attend and listen to what everybody had to say. Father Art got on the phone, and he called all the people he had married, all the people he had baptized in the church. And I'd say 90% of those people weren't attending Good Shepherd, but they were all invited to the meeting with the bishop. So I was smart enough when I came to that meeting. I sat in the back row and I just wanted to listen. And the meeting went on and talked about what was going on with Father Art's ministry and so forth. And bless this person's soul, somebody stood up to talk about this person had been a senior warden under Father Art, and they shared how things had gone while this person was senior warden, and she literally got booed off her feet. And Bishop Winterud is a bishop, and I hope most bishops are pretty smart, because a third of the way into that meeting, he knew exactly what was going on. And so the meeting obviously was very favorable to Father Art. But about a week later, the bishop called Father Art into his office. And Bishop Winterud said, look, you're a very spiritual person. You have a special gift. I want you to come on my staff and conduct spiritual meetings and seminars and so forth. And I think it'll work real well. I won't tell you exactly what Father Art said, but in polite terms, it was no. And the bishop said, okay. He said, today's your last day of being the rector of Good Shepherd, but the church has not given you a sabbatical in several years. And so I'm going to give you a 1-year sabbatical. And your service in terms of being the priest of Good Shepherd ends today. And so that was good, except I talked to the bishop and I said, Bishop, how are we going to pay for a 1-year sabbatical and supply priest at our church? We're going to talk about those supply priests next time. But if you look at the bottom line over there, the diocese paid $50,000 for his sabbatical. And in reality, if you think back on this, I didn't tell you this, and Whitney, I think, knows this. Father Art had a plan in mind. He was pretty sharp. His plan was, in 6 months, I'm going to tell this church when I'm going to retire, and then I'm going to tell them I'm going to retire a year from now. So he was looking for a year and a half. He got almost that year and a half with the sabbatical. Then he got 18 years in towards his pension. I think you can understand, having heard that story, and I'm not trying to tell a negative story, I'm just telling a story. you can understand why he's only been back in the church a couple times since he left, because he didn't leave, obviously, on the greatest of terms. Fortunately, I was pretty close to him, and I've seen him several times, and we still have a good rapport, and we get along pretty well. But I mean, you heard there probably the last 2 or 3 years of his service here, but you got to remember, he had 12 to 15 years of great service here and growing a church and where we are today. And so, I've always been very respectful of him, and I think he did some wonderful things for this church.
Jim, didn't Sandy play a role in that prior to?
Yeah. I know Sandy has things to say. How much time do we have? Okay, we got plenty of time.
Okay.
I'll let Sandy talk and we'll answer some questions, and then we'll talk about the answers to the questions, although I think I gave you most of them.
I was ordained priest in 1979 in the East Coast and spent a generation being the first woman invited to do services at various places, and began doing interim ministry, which a number of women in my generation were doing. And I loved that ministry because it was a time where I could work with the congregation to understand that it was the body of Christ in the community. And this is its church. And to move out of the mindset, which was so common in those eras, that they couldn't do anything till they got a rector, father, whoever it was going to be. And I followed, I would encourage them, yes, you can, because you are the body of Christ here. So I moved here in 1990, the end of 1990, to Willow Creek. And I had a job as a librarian at Regis University. And I began to do helping out in various parishes like I'd been doing. It was the second generation of doing that, of being the first woman to do that and invited to come and supply or whatever. So I was at St. Barnabas when I first came here, and then lived right here. And there was a woman here whose name I've forgotten, who was assisting Art. So he was okay on the women thing. He had a woman, very part-time assistant, and she left with her husband to go somewhere. And somehow
Linda Syracuse.
Was it? No, it wasn't Linda Syracuse. She was
before
later.
her.
Yeah, it was somebody else. And so I looked in my calendar and my stuff to find out this. And in June of 1992, I came and talked to Art about being an assistant for like $500 a month. It was a big salary, but I was full-time at the university. And in October 4th of 1992 was my first Sunday here. And so in October 24th of 1992, Diane Moore, who had been raised up out of this congregation and supported by Art Leclare, was ordained deacon. And October 25th of 1992, we had a wonderful celebration of her. And I'll put this notebook back there, but there's pictures here of the party that we had in October 25th. There's Diane. And Art Leclare was having health problems and went into the hospital for a lengthy period of time. And so from that time on, Diane and I were in charge and were the clergy for this parish. And we had a wonderful time from October until August of 93. November of 93. And that was the time of Doris Trular's son's death. And just a brief story about that. I was called by Doris to Boulder Community Hospital, and her son had died of a drug overdose. And I had Sunday school the next day with the kids. And it was an incredible time. It was just an incredible time. But I will say about Art is that he was a very spiritual man, and I celebrating with him or whatever at the altar was a blessed time for me, very healing. And I really, really treasured that. And then of course, did it with Diane as deacon for a number of months. April of 94. So it's from October of 92 to April of 94. Diane had been released from this parish in December of 93, and I was let go by Art in 94. And there was quite an uproar about that among the leadership here. And there was a wonderful party for me, and I have pictures of that. And that's where you will see Art Moore and Whitney Hill in the pictures here, and Jim Wolf too. So I had a year and a half here, and it's been my place. And then I began to develop a network. Not much, hardly any help from the diocese, began to do interim ministry and go here and go there and go and supply and so forth. And so I was during that time. The one story about Art that's also, I think, helps understand this what was going on here in that period of time. The Altar Guild asked me one time, well, they were going to have an annual meeting in 3 weeks or something, and could I celebrate the Eucharist for them at that meeting? And so I went to Art. I'm just the $500 a month assistant. And I said, that I wanted to know if it would be all right for me to do that. And he said, yes. And I said, well, are there certain kinds of things that I can say yes to? And he said, well, if somebody asks you for something like that, tell them you need to check your calendar and come and ask me. So that was kind of like a big clue about what Jim has been talking about in terms of I'm in charge here. I mean, I just wanted a general idea about what I was free to do beyond just being here on Sunday. So it was a wonderful time. And then between times I've come in and out, but that's my major story. And I'll put the pictures back there for you all.
I'm not sure when Art wrote this, but this is what he called the Good Shepherd Preamble. And there's copies of this in the back, and you can have it. I'm going to read it. We believe that where people are gathered together in love, God is present, and good things happen, and life is full. We believe that we are immersed in mystery, that our lives are more than they seem, that we belong to each other and to a universe of great creative energies whose source and destiny is God. We believe that God is after us, that he is calling to us from the depth of human life. We believe that God has risked himself and become man in Jesus. In and with Jesus, we believe that each of us is situated in the love of God, and the pattern of our life will be the pattern of Jesus, through death to resurrection. We believe that the Spirit of peace is present with us, the church, as we gather to celebrate our common existence and resurrection of Jesus and the fidelity of God. And most deeply, we believe that in our struggle to love, we incarnate God in the world. And so aware of mystery and wonder, caught in friendship and laughter, we become speechless before the joy in our hearts and celebrate the sacredness of life in the Eucharist. That's something that Art wrote, and he called it the Good Shepherd Preamble. There's copies of it in back, but I think it reflects the spirituality of Father Art and the spirituality that he had. I wished he had dated that. Okay. Who is Jim Gray then? Some of you knew, but the reason I put that up there, as Mark shared at our coffee hour this morning, he was the first senior warden of Good Shepherd. And if you go down the hallway when you get a chance, there's pictures of Father Art, John Johansson, and Father Craig. And at some point in time, we'll actually get a picture of Father Gary. And you don't have to be dead or leave to put your picture up. And every senior warden is on the walls there, and it's just interesting. It's interesting to me because I've been here 37 years. I mean, it was interesting to me to go read them again and see who had been here.
Just, it's not their picture, but.
I'm sorry, it's a plaque, right? The pictures are only of the records. We originally owned 2.2 acres. Why did we own them? I didn't tell that story, but it's a funny story to me.
Jim, you're not in the shot.
Yeah, okay. What happened there was, there was actually a company that was going to build back here. And we had negotiated with them, and we negotiated, they wanted to use part of our entrance. And it turned out they were putting their entrance to whatever they were going to put back there. And I don't remember, I don't think it was apartments originally, but they were coming on our property. And so we negotiated, we'd sell them a piece of our property for them to drive in and out for $25,000. Okay, the whole thing fell through. And so next thing we knew, we had a new company called UAE. And they came in and they announced they were going to put apartments back there. And they offered us $10,000 for the property back there. The property out here on our property. And we said, there's no way. And so we started negotiating with them, and the negotiation got very interesting.
This is just insurance.
Because they basically reached a point where they said, we're not going to pay you anything. So we started investigating to see, there was a company called UAE out of Greeley. And we were trying to figure out who, there had to be money behind this company. And it turned out it was the Mumford brothers, who now own the Rockies and own the meat packing factory in Greeley and so forth. So we told them, okay, if you're not going to pay us, we're going, when you start your development there, we're going to actually parade out there. And we're going to hand out certificates, and we're going to announce that the Mumford brothers are behind this and they're too cheap to pay for property they're going across. And the next day we had an offer. The next day we had an offer for $20,000, and we negotiated that, and we actually sold them 1.31 acres so that they could put it on. Now, the thing that's always bugged me, two things bug me about that. Number one is the whole negotiation is in this notebook. When John Johansson found out I had this notebook, he said, we need to keep this in the church for future reference in case it ever comes up again. So I said, fine. So I gave it to him. And then a couple times a question did come up, and I asked John, I said, where's the book? And he said, I have no idea. And so about 6 months ago, there was a bunch of books stacked underneath the counter downstairs, and people had decided it's just garbage and we'll get rid of it. And this book was in the middle of that. So I have the book now, and nobody's going to pry it away from me for a while after all that happened. But we used Larry Hitt as our person, and we cut the deal. Now, the piece that has always bothered me, they hadn't built yet. They were just starting to think about building their apartments. The stop sign was supposed to be on their property, and the church was going to have the right of way in and out. And obviously that never happened. And from a practical standpoint, it probably is right that the stop sign is on the church property. But if I wanted to take them to court, I could get the stop sign moved. I don't think we're going to do that. That's number three. Number two, that's why we don't own 2.2 acres. Why did the diocese pay the $20,000 to help us buy the property, $50,000 to pay for Father Art's sabbatical? I only say that because so often we hear that we're paying a pledge to the diocese, and people think, do we ever get anything back from the diocese? And obviously you can see there that we do get stuff back from the diocese, and they have supported us. How do I know who the senior warden was every year? Just walk down towards Father Gary's office and you'll see everybody. When did Hungry Flock start? 4 months after the initial start of the church. With that, questions,
Comments?
comments? Yes.
So just out of curiosity, what would you say the worship style was when he was here? And the reason I ask that is some of those people, if he had been a Roman and then some of the people left to go to
Christ Church.
Church, or, you know,
Kind of.
they're not exactly
The-
Anglo, are they? Christ Church?
No, they're probably, if I had to characterize them,
No.
the word that we use today, I would use orthodox, but that word also means conservative.
Right.
Yeah, so they
Well,
are
he
conservative.
was okay with me.
Well, yeah.
I think the worship style, I didn't notice any difference in the worship style. And I've been all around the country in Episcopal churches. So I don't think there was anything in his worship style that caused people to leave. I think it was everything had to go through him, and he could stop stuff.
I wasn't implying that they left because of him. I was just wondering because, and I've never attended a service at Christ Church, but being there and kind of knowing Joseph, it seemed pretty high church. And so
Joseph's the assistant.
Yeah.
he's not-
Yeah, and Terry McGugan is one of my best friends, and he's the rector at Christ Church. I've attended services there, and they're pretty much like ours. I mean, there's nothing there that I would say is high church.
Back to Nadine's question, though, it was a lot higher here
at that time.
in terms of high church, meaning more bells and smells.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
Than
Christ
what I
Church,
was
yeah.
used to, because I grew up in southern Texas, and no, you didn't pass the peace.
Yeah.
The priest Mark always said, he said, I'll go you and sit out. And some early experiences we had here, it was like, wow, man, then there's bells and then there's smells. So I would call it high church. It may have not been as high as.
let me say something.
not like St. Andrews.
I will say this. I'm an only child, as most of you probably know, if you've seen my actions. But I also, Bev's parents and my parents don't live here. Good Shepherd is my church family. It is my family. And it's been that way since we got here. And so we've seen a number of rectors come and go, and I flow with rectors. I've been here through all of them. And I always remember what one of my best friends in this church said one day, when we were talking about the church and the direction we were going. And he was talking to the rector, and he said, look, you're going to leave and I'm still going to be here. So what you say does not necessarily mean that that's what we're going to do. And if you know the bishop, what the bishop says is, I want churches in this diocese that are lay led and clergy supported. Now, we're probably never going to quite get there, but at least she recognizes the importance of laity in churches and the support they need. And so I applaud her for that. So, questions, anything else we can do for you today? I'm sorry we don't have some of the people that originally started. Their stories would be a lot more juicy. But yeah. No,
I'm gonna,
yeah. And Whit was in the middle of a lot of everything I talked about. Yes.
you've got him.
Oh, yeah, did you?
I heard several people telling stories about how kids were passed over the fence to the church. I always presumed it was from one of the houses in Hendersonville. You know what that even harkens to, but you're shaking your head, you know?
I do not.
If you pick up the history that Trish Hartman put together, I think it might have been her kids, but there were people living behind.
Oh,
House
okay,
that joined, and instead of walking around with us.
okay. Yeah, okay, that story, the story you're talking about, Joyce, is Julie Waddle and her family lived in the house behind Father Art. And so what you're hearing, what you heard was they actually passed children over the fence because they could do that easily because she lived right behind.
We weren't casting them out.
I
Yeah.
was told to get them to Sunday school.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and Julia's moved, but Father Art's still there. Bev and I drove by the house a while back, and
Well, actually, the family who's there now, and one of the houses there has a gate that they put in.
yeah, that makes it easier.
I want to say I didn't highlight enough that tomorrow is Diane Moore's 30th ordination anniversary. So I have a card and I'm going to put it back there. So if any of you would like to sign that, I'll send it to her because it's 30 years ago tomorrow that I was describing these events.
And Diane Moore, one of the big things she did is she's one that got us involved with St. Francis Center.
Yeah,
And one of the very first ministries that we did from an outreach standpoint with working with the homeless in downtown Denver was St. Francis Center. And Diane was very influential in doing that. And you heard me talk about how the bishop knew about what was going on at Good Shepherd with Bert Womack and the conversations and the lunches I had with him. Bert Womack is the founder of St. Francis Center.
Yeah.
And so, the stories just keep going on and on when you've been around. I mean, we were laughing this morning at coffee hour because I told a number of stories that I probably wouldn't even say up here, but they were equally funny. I mean, they're funny now. Almost everything that might have been tragic at the time. I don't know if we can ever say some of that got funny, but you kind of laugh about it today. Yeah, compared to when you were in the middle of it. Yeah. Joyce?
I'm sorry to make this, but what year did Bill Henley? Was he early?
I don't think Bill, was Bill here when Father Art was here?
I'm not sure if he was, he would have
I don't-
laughed maybe a little, but I don't remember that.
I think Bill Henwood actually came in when John Johansson was here.
yes, I think so.
Yeah.
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 Well, Jim, I'm Eleanor Hubbard, in case any of you don't know me. One reason that I wasn't known very much is because I was a big choir person for my entire life, as was Ken. And so I was always in the choir, but the choir was kind of a little power group unto itself. And it got a reputation for being that before we were aware of it. But once we heard that people regarded us that way, then we thought,
I think the choir was like that. I think the men's group was like that.
Yeah.
You had different organizations.
Always.
The other thing I wanted to be sure and mention, the person I wanted to be sure and mention was my longtime friend, Heather Land, and I met her through the League of Women Voters when we were living in Cherry Hills, and then saw her as a true friend when one of our kids ended up, who was at CC, by the way, Sandy Boyd I had a couple of my kids, calling us, and he was sitting on a big rock at CC and contemplating suicide because he'd gotten involved with drugs.
Oh, wow.
And this, to me, was something that only happened to other people, of course, and especially not to him, and so on. And Heather was the only person among my friends that I felt like I could trust that information to. So she was really an extraordinary friend, and she was a character, and she was funny, and she was incredibly outspoken.
Yes.
And she was one of the founders. And so I got to hear all sorts of stories, many of which I don't think are actually true, but about what the kids were up to while the parents were in the basement and all sorts of things like that. But I just wanted to say, Ken and I I'd been, I guess, baptized when my family lived in Sterling, Colorado, and we're both native Coloradans, which is sort of peculiar. And Ken became an Episcopalian after we were married, which was kind of it, but we were married.
Methodist to Episcopalian.
Yeah,
Methodist to
in the
Episcopalian.
Methodist Church in Glenwood Springs with the Methodist minister's son, Jamie, as our best man, and that minister offering the church up and being kind of an assistant to the Episcopal minister who was my minister, so a shared process. And that was a very sort of collegial atmosphere among various ministers in a small town, no surprise. And the guy that was our minister was from Wales, and so he was very Anglican, but very low church in the old sense of that, where you had traditional forms that were low church and traditional forms that were high church. Now, I think people think of low church as being where you don't necessarily follow traditional forms. And high church is if you happen to have someone who can chant, which is a marvelous gift. And I don't know how those work, but there were all sorts of personalities from DC to Cambridge, Mass to Colorado that Ken and I experienced as the rectors of the church. And especially Ken was always one to get involved, and I was more on the edges. And so we didn't realize that having someone with Art Leclare's various personality qualities, extremely bright, extremely, the spirit was really there. as
Spiritual.
Pastoral.
now
Pastoral spiritual.
within him, very strong-willed, all that sort of thing didn't seem like a big deal to us because of the different kinds of guys that we'd had as rectors or vicars along the way. But it really did cause quite an uproar in the church. And I think there was a quality of people that were part of the early years in Good Shepherd through the 90s that were very strong-willed people. And I think there were also a number of people, like I think of Dennis Applebaum, who had been through some adventures in other churches that we had also been part of. And they knew that the best way to handle it was to get it done and not just let it fester. And that was also, you know, wanting to, especially when it came, I think, to Father Art, Dennis's feeling was it had to be done, taken care of, and get on with things. And of course, that was contrary to the way Father Art wanted it to be done. And so that, you know, it's not an unusual experience for churches to have
Strong
people
will.
within the church that would like things to be done their way, and
Right.
rectors, vicars,
Come and go.
etc. Even senior wardens that have pretty good ideas about how things should be done that don't get them done. So
I just want to add one thing to what you just said. There's two women in this church that have been my conscience over the year.
I bet one was Heather.
Heather Land was one of them, and the other one is sitting in the back row today, and that's Joyce Manning. When they were concerned about something or they just wanted to talk, they would call me, and I knew when I got a call, my wife even knew this, when I got a call from Heather Land or I got a call from Joyce Manning, I was going to sit there for 20 to 30 minutes and listen. and I did that, and I learned that over the years. So we'll end it there. Yeah. Any questions? You can always grab me. Sandra will put this in the back, the card, and thank you very much. And I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you.